light coming from inside. She closed the door again and said in a matter-of-fact tone, not to worry, that it was nothing and that she was going to make us something to eat. With the speed and efficiency of a short-order cook, she made some food. We also made a hot chocolate drink with cornmeal. We sat across from each other and ate in complete silence. The night was cold. It looked as if it was going to rain. The 3 kerosene lanterns that she had brought to the dining area cast a yellowish light that was very soothing. She took some boards that were stacked up on the floor against the wall and placed them vertically in a deep groove on the transverse supporting beam of the roof. There was a long slit in the floor parallel to the beam that served to hold the boards in place. The result was a portable wall that enclosed the dining area. Who was in the bed? I asked. In bed next to you was Josefina. Who else? She replied, as if savoring her words, and then laughed. She's a master at jokes like that. For a moment I thought it was something else, but then I caught the scent that Josefina's body has when she's carrying out one of her pranks. What was she trying to do, scare me to death? I asked. You're not their favorite, you know, she replied. They don't like to be taken out of the path they're familiar with. They hate the fact that Soledad is leaving. They don't want to understand that we are all leaving this area. It looks like our time is up. I knew that today. As I left the house, I felt that those barren hills out there were making me tired. I had never felt that way until today. Where are you going to go? I don't know yet. It looks as if that depends on you, on your power. On me? In what way, Gorda? Let me explain. The day before you arrived, the little sisters and I went to the city. I wanted to find you in the city because I had a very strange vision in my dreaming. In that vision, I was in the city with you. I saw you in my vision as plainly as I see you now. You didn't know who I was, but you talked to me. I couldn't make out what you said. I went back to the same vision 3 times, but I wasn't strong enough in my dreaming to find out what you were saying to me. I figured that my vision was telling me that I had to go to the city and trust my power to find you there. I was sure that you were on your way. Did the little sisters know why you took them to the city? I asked. I didn't tell them anything, she replied. I just took them there. We wandered around the streets all morning. Her statements put me in a very strange frame of mind. Spasms of nervous excitation ran through my entire body. I had to stand up and walk around for a moment. I sat down again and told her that I had been in the city the same day and that I had wandered around the marketplace all afternoon looking for Don Juan. She stared at me with her mouth open. We must have passed each other, she said, and sighed. We were in the market and in the park. We sat on the steps of the church most of the afternoon so as not to attract attention to ourselves. The hotel where I had stayed was practically next door to the church. I remembered that I had stood for a long time looking at the people on the steps of the church. Something was pulling me to examine them. I had the absurd notion that both Don Juan and Don Genaro were going to be among those people, sitting like beggars just to surprise me. When did you leave the city? I asked. We left around 5 o'clock and headed for the Nagual spot in the mountains, she replied. I had also had the certainty that Don Juan had left at the end of the day. The feelings I had had during that entire episode of looking for Don Juan became very clear to me. In light of what she had told me, I had to revise my stand. I had conveniently explained away the certainty I had had that Don Juan was there in the streets of the city as an irrational expectation, a result of my consistently finding him there in the past. But La Gorda had been in the city actually looking for me, and she was the being closest to Don Juan in temperament. I had felt all along that his presence was there. La Gorda's statement had merely confirmed something that my body knew beyond the shadow of a doubt. I noticed a flutter of nervousness in her body when I told her the details of my mood that day. "What would have happened if you had found me?" I asked. "Everything would have been changed," she replied. "For me to find you would have meant that I had enough power to move forward. That's why I took the little sisters with me. All of us, you, me, and the little sisters, would have gone away together that day." "Where to, Gorda?" "Who knows? If I had the power to find you, I would have also had the power to know that. It's your turn now. Perhaps you will have enough power now to know where we should go. Do you see what I mean?" I had an attack of profound sadness at that point. I felt more acutely than ever the despair of my human frailty and temporariness. Don Juan had always maintained that the only deterrent to our despair was the awareness of our death, the key to the sorcerer's scheme of things. His idea was that the awareness of our death was the only thing that could give us the strength to withstand the duress and pain of our lives and our fears of the unknown. But what he could never tell me was how to bring that awareness to the foreground. He had insisted every time I had asked him that my volition alone was the deciding factor. In other words, I had to make up my mind to bring that awareness to bear witness to my acts. I thought I had done so. But confronted with La Gorda's determination to find me and go away with me, I realized that if she had found me in the city that day, I would never have returned to my home. Never again would I have seen those I held dear. I had not been prepared for that. I had braced myself for dying, but not for disappearing for the rest of my life in full awareness, without anger or disappointment, leaving behind the best of my feelings. I was almost embarrassed to tell La Gorda that I was not a warrior worthy of having the kind of power that must be needed to perform an act of that nature. To leave for good and to know where to go and what to do. "We are human creatures," she said. "Who knows what's waiting for us, or what kind of power we may have?" I told her that my sadness in leaving like that was too great. The changes that sorcerers went through were too drastic and too final. I recounted to her what Pablito had told me about his unbearable sadness at having lost his mother. "The human form feeds itself on those feelings," she said dryly. "I pitied myself and my little children for years. I couldn't understand how the Nagual could be so cruel to ask me to do what I did, to leave my children, to destroy them, and to forget them." She said that it took her years to understand that the Nagual also had to choose to leave the human form. He was not being cruel. He simply didn't have any more human feelings. To him, everything was equal. He had accepted his fate. The problem with Pablito, and myself for that matter, was that neither of us had accepted our fate. La Gorda said in a scornful way that Pablito wept when he remembered his mother, his Manuelita, especially when he had to cook his own food. She urged me to remember Pablito's mother as she was, an old, stupid woman who knew nothing else but to be Pablito's servant. She said that the reason all of them thought he was a coward was because he couldn't be happy that his servant Manuelita had become the witch Soledad, who could kill him like she would step on a bug. La Gorda stood up dramatically and leaned over the table until her forehead was almost touching mine. "The Nagual said that Pablito's good fortune was extraordinary," she said. "Mother and son fighting for the same thing. If he weren't the coward he is, he would accept his fate and oppose Soledad like a warrior without fear or hatred. In the end, the best would win and take all. If Soledad is the winner, Pablito should be happy with his fate and wish her well, but Only a real warrior can feel that kind of happiness. How does Doña Soledad feel about all this? She doesn't indulge in her feelings, La Gorda replied, and sat down again. She has accepted her fate more readily than any one of us. Before the Nagual helped her, she was worse off than myself. At least I was young. She was an old cow, fat and tired, begging for her death to come. Now death will have to fight to claim her. The time element in Doña Soledad's transformation was a detail that had puzzled me. I told La Gorda that I remembered having seen Doña Soledad no more than 2 years before, and she was the same old lady I had always known. La Gorda said that the last time I had been in Soledad's house, under the impression that it was still Pablito's house, the Nagual had set them up to act as if everything were the same. Doña Soledad greeted me as she always did from the kitchen, and I really didn't face her. Lydia, Rosa, Pablito, and Nestor played their roles to perfection in order to keep me from finding out about their true activities. Why would the Nagual go to all that trouble, Gorda? He was saving you for something that's not clear yet. He kept you away from every one of us deliberately. He and Genaro told me never to show my face when you were around. Did they tell Josefina the same thing? Yes. She's crazy and can't help herself. She wanted to play her pranks on you. She used to follow you around and you never knew it. One night when the Nagual had taken you to the mountains, she nearly pushed you down a ravine in the darkness. The Nagual found her in the nick of time. She doesn't do those things out of meanness, but because she enjoys being that way. That's her human form. She'll be that way until she loses it. I've told you that all 6 of them are a bit off. You must be aware of that, so as not to be caught in their webs. If you do get caught, don't get angry. They can't help themselves. She was silent for a while. I caught the almost imperceptible sign of a flutter in her body. Her eyes seemed to get out of focus and her mouth dropped as if the muscles of her jaw had given in. I became engrossed in watching her. She shook her head 2 or 3 times. "I've just seen something," she said. "You're just like the little sisters and the Genaros." She began to laugh quietly. I didn't say anything. I wanted her to explain herself without my meddling. "Everybody gets angry with you because it hasn't dawned on them yet that you're no different than they are," she went on. "They see you as the Nagual and they don't understand that you indulge in your ways just like they do in theirs." She said that Pablito whined and complained and played at being a weakling. Benigno played the shy one, the one who couldn't even open his eyes. Nestor played to be the wise one, the one who knows everything. Lydia played the tough woman who could crush anyone with a look. Josefina was the crazy one who couldn't be trusted. Rosa was the bad-tempered girl who ate the mosquitoes that bit her. And I was the fool that came from Los Angeles with a pad of paper and lots of wrong questions. And all of us loved to be the way we were. "I was once a fat, smelly woman," she went on after a pause. "I didn't mind being kicked around like a dog as long as I wasn't alone. That was my fault. I will have to tell everybody what I have seen about you, so they won't feel offended by your acts." I didn't know what to say. I felt that she was undeniably right. The important issue for me was not so much her accurateness, but the fact that I had witnessed her arriving at her unquestionable conclusion. "How did you see all that?" I asked. "It just came to me," she replied. "How did it come to you?" I felt the feeling of seeing coming to the top of my head, and then I knew what I've just told you. I insisted that she describe to me every detail of the feeling of seeing that she was alluding to. She complied after a moment's vacillation and gave me an account of the same ticklish sensation I had become so aware of during my confrontations with Doña Soledad and the Little Sisters. La Gorda said that the sensation started on the top of her head and then went down her back and around her waist to her womb. She felt it inside her body as a consuming ticklishness, which turned into the knowledge that I was clinging to my human form like all the rest, except that my particular way was incomprehensible to them. "Did you hear a voice telling you all that?" I asked. "No, I just saw everything I've told you about yourself," she replied. I wanted to ask her if she had had a vision of me clinging to something, but I desisted. I didn't want to indulge in my usual behavior. Besides, I knew what she meant when she said that she saw. The same thing had happened to me when I was with Rosa and Lydia. I suddenly knew where they lived. I hadn't had a vision of their house. I simply felt that I knew it. I asked her if she had also felt a dry sound of a wooden pipe being broken at the base of her neck. "The Nagual taught all of us how to get the feeling on top of the head," she said. "But not every one of us can do it. The sound behind the throat is even more difficult. None of us has ever felt it yet. It's strange that you have when you're still empty." "How does that sound work?" I asked. "And what is it?" "You know that better than I do. What more can I tell you?" she replied in a harsh voice. She seemed to catch herself being impatient. She smiled sheepishly and lowered her head. "I feel stupid telling you what you already know," she said. "Do you ask me questions like that to test if I have really lost my form?" I told her that I was confused, for I had the feeling that I knew what that sound was, and yet it was as if I didn't know anything about it, because for me to know something, I actually had to be able to verbalize my knowledge. In this case, I didn't even know how to begin verbalizing it. The only thing I could do, therefore, was to ask her questions, hoping that her answers would help me. "I can't help you with that sound," she said. I experienced a sudden and tremendous discomfort. I told her that I was habituated to dealing with Don Juan and that I needed him then more than ever to explain everything to me. "Do you miss the Nagual?" she asked. I said that I did, and that I hadn't realized how much I missed him until I was back again in his homeland. "You miss him because you're still clinging to your human form," she said, and giggled as if she were delighted at my sadness. "Don't you miss him yourself, Gorda?" "No, not me. I'm him. All my luminosity has been changed. How could I miss something that is myself?" "How is your luminosity different?" "A human being or any other living creature has a pale yellow glow. Animals are more yellow, humans are more white, but a sorcerer is amber, like clear honey in the sunlight. Some women sorceresses are greenish. The Nagual said that those are the most powerful and the most difficult." "What color are you, Gorda?" "Amber, just like you and all the rest of us." That's what the Nagual and Genaro told me. I've never seen myself, but I've seen everyone else. All of us are amber, and all of us, with the exception of you, are like a tombstone. Average human beings are like eggs. That's why the Nagual called them luminous eggs. Sorcerers change not only the color of their luminosity, but their shape. We are like tombstones, only we are round at both ends. Am I still shaped like an egg, Gorda? No, you're shaped like a tombstone, except that you have an ugly, dull patch in your middle. As long as you have that patch, you won't be able to fly like sorcerers fly, like I flew last night for you. You won't even be able to drop your human form. I became entangled in a passionate argument, not so much with her as with myself. I insisted that their stand on how to regain that alleged completeness was simply preposterous. I told her that she couldn't possibly argue successfully with me that one had to turn one's back to one's own children in order to pursue the vaguest of all possible goals, to enter into the world of the Nagual. I was so thoroughly convinced that I was right that I got carried away and shouted angry words at her. She was not in any way flustered by my outburst. "Not everybody has to do that," she said. "Only sorcerers who want to enter into the other world. There are plenty of good sorcerers who see and are incomplete. To be complete is only for us Toltecs. Take Soledad, for instance. She's the best witch you can find, and she's incomplete. She had 2 children. One of them was a girl. Fortunately for Soledad, her daughter died. The Nagual said that the edge of the spirit of a person who dies goes back to the givers, meaning that that edge goes back to the parents. If the givers are dead and the person has children, the edge goes to the child who is complete. And if all the children are complete, that edge goes to the one with power, and not necessarily to the best or the most diligent. For example, when Josefina's mother died, the edge went to the craziest of the lot, Josefina. It should have gone to her brother, who is a hard-working, responsible man, but Josefina is more powerful than her brother. Soledad's daughter died without leaving any children, and Soledad got a boost that closed half her hole. Now, the only hope she has to close it completely is for Pablito to die. And by the same token, Pablito's great hope for a boost is for Soledad to die. I told her in very strong terms that what she was saying was disgusting and horrifying to me. She agreed that I was right. She affirmed that at one time she herself had believed that that particular sorcerer's stand was the ugliest thing possible. She looked at me with shining eyes. There was something malicious about her grin. "The Nagual told me that you understand everything, but you don't want to do anything about it," she said in a soft voice. I began to argue again. I told her that what the Nagual had said about me had nothing to do with my revulsion for the particular stand that we were discussing. I explained that I liked children, that I had the most profound respect for them, and that I empathized very deeply with their helplessness in the awesome world around them. I couldn't conceive hurting a child in any sense, not for any reason. "The Nagual didn't make the rule," she said. "The rule is made somewhere out there, and not by a man." I defended myself by saying that I wasn't angry with her or the Nagual, but that I was arguing in the abstract because I could not fathom the value of it all. The value is that we need all our edge, all our power, our completeness in order to enter into that other world, she said. I was a religious woman. I could tell you what I used to repeat without knowing what I meant. I wanted my soul to enter the kingdom of heaven. I still want that, except that I'm on a different path. The world of the Nagual is the kingdom of heaven. I objected to her religious connotation on principle. I had become accustomed by Don Juan never to dwell on that subject. She very calmly explained that she saw no difference in terms of lifestyle between us and true nuns and priests. She pointed out that not only were true nuns and priests complete as a rule, but they did not even weaken themselves with sexual acts. The Nagual said that is the reason they will never be exterminated, no matter who tries to exterminate them, she said. Those who are after them are always empty. They don't have the vigor that true nuns and priests have. I liked the Nagual for saying that. I will always cheer for the nuns and priests. We're alike. We have given up the world, and yet we are in the midst of it. Priests and nuns would make great flying sorcerers if someone would tell them that they can do it. The memory of my father's and my grandfather's admiration for the Mexican Revolution came to my mind. They mostly admired the attempt to exterminate the clergy. My father inherited that admiration from his father, and I inherited it from both of them. It was a sort of affiliation that we had. One of the first things that Don Juan undermined in my personality was that affiliation. I once told Don Juan, as if I were voicing my own opinion, something I had heard all my life, that the favorite ploy of the church was to keep us in ignorance. Don Juan had a most serious expression on his face. It was as if my statements had touched a deep fiber in him. I thought immediately of the centuries of exploitation that the Indians had endured. "Those dirty bastards," he said. "They have kept me in ignorance, and you too." I caught his irony right away, and we both laughed. I had never really examined that stand. I didn't believe it, but I had nothing else to take its place. I told Don Juan about my grandfather and my father and their views on religion as the liberal men they were. "It doesn't matter what anybody says or does," he said. "You must be an impeccable man yourself. The fight is right here in this chest." He patted my chest gently. "If your grandfather and father would be trying to be impeccable warriors," Don Juan went on, "they wouldn't have time for petty fights. It takes all the time and all the energy we have to conquer the idiocy in us. And that's what matters. The rest is of no importance. Nothing of what your grandfather or father said about the church gave them well-being. To be an impeccable warrior, on the other hand, will give you vigor and youth and power. So it is proper for you to choose wisely." My choice was the impeccability and simplicity of a warrior's life. Because of that choice, I felt that I had to take La Gorda's words in a most serious manner, and that was more threatening to me than even Don Genaro's acts. He used to frighten me at a most profound level. His actions, although terrifying, were assimilated, however, into the coherent continuum of their teachings. La Gorda's words and actions were a different kind of threat to me, somehow more concrete and real than the other. La Gorda's body shivered for a moment. A ripple went through it, making her contract the muscles of her shoulders and arms. She grabbed the edge of the table with an awkward rigidity. Then she relaxed until she was again her usual self. She smiled at me. Her eyes and smile were dazzling. She said in a casual tone that she had just seen my dilemma. "It's useless to close your eyes and pretend that you don't want to do anything or that you don't want to know anything," she said. "You can do that with people, but not with me. I know now why the Nagual commissioned me to tell you all this. I'm a nobody. You admire great people. The Nagual and Genaro were the greatest of all." She stopped and examined me. She seemed to be waiting for my reaction to what she said. "You fought against what the Nagual and Genaro told you all the way," she went on. "That's why you're behind. And you fought them because they were great. That's your particular way of being. But you can't fight against what I tell you because you can't look up to me at all. I am your peer. I am in your cycle. You like to fight those who are better than you. It's no challenge to fight my stand. So, those two devils have finally bagged you through me. Poor little Nagual. You've lost the game." She came closer to me and whispered in my ear that the Nagual had also said that she should never try to take my writing pad away from me, because that would be as dangerous as trying to snatch a bone from a hungry dog's mouth. She put her arms around me, resting her head on my shoulders, and laughed quietly and softly. Her seeing had numbed me. I knew that she was absolutely right. She had pegged me to perfection. She hugged me for a long time with her head against mine. The proximity of her body somehow was very soothing. She was just like Don Juan at that. She exuded strength and conviction and purpose. She was wrong to say that I could not admire her. Let's forget this, she said suddenly. Let's talk about what we have to do tonight. What exactly are we going to do tonight, Gorda? We have our last appointment with power. Is it another dreadful battle with somebody? No. The Little Sisters are simply going to show you something that will complete your visit here. The Nagual told me that after that, you may go away and never return, or that you may choose to stay with us. Either way, what they have to show you is their art. The art of the dreamer. And what is that art? Genaro told me that he tried time and time again to acquaint you with the art of the dreamer. He showed you his other body, his body of dreaming. Once he even made you be in two places at once, but your emptiness didn't let you see what he was pointing out to you. It looks as if all his efforts went through the hole in your body. Now, it seems that it is different. Genaro made the Little Sisters the dreamers that they are, and tonight they will show you Genaro's art. In that respect, the Little Sisters are the true children of Genaro. That reminded me of what Pablito had said earlier, that we were the children of both, and that we were Toltecs. I asked her what he had meant by that. The Nagual told me that sorcerers used to be called Toltecs in his benefactor's language, she replied. And what language was that, Gorda? He never told me, but he and Genaro used to speak a language that none of us could understand. And here, between all of us, we understand 4 Indian languages. Did Don Genaro also say that he was a Toltec? His benefactor was the same man, so he also said the same thing. From La Gorda's responses, I could surmise that she either didn't know a great deal on the subject, or she didn't want to talk to me about it. I confronted her with my conclusions. She confessed that she had never paid much attention to it, and wondered why I was putting so much value on it. I practically gave her a lecture on the ethnography of central Mexico. A sorcerer is a Toltec when that sorcerer has received the mysteries of stalking and dreaming, she said casually. The Nagual and Genaro received those mysteries from their benefactor, and then they held them in their bodies. We are doing the same, and because of that, we are Toltecs, like the Nagual and Genaro. The Nagual taught you and me equally to be dispassionate. I am more dispassionate than you because I'm formless. You still have your form and are empty, so you get caught in every snag. One day, however, you'll be complete again, and you'll understand then that the Nagual was right. He said that the world of people goes up and down, and people go up and down with their world. As sorcerers, we have no business following them in their ups and downs. The art of sorcerers is to be outside everything and be unnoticeable. And more than anything else, the art of sorcerers is never to waste their power. The Nagual told me that your problem is that you always get caught in idiocy, like what you're doing now. I'm sure that you're going to ask every one of us about the Toltecs, but you're not going to ask any one of us about our attention. Her laughter was clear and contagious. I admitted to her that she was right. Small issues had always fascinated me. I also told her that I was mystified by her usage of the word attention. I've told you already what the Nagual told me about attention, she said. We hold the images of the world with our attention. A male sorcerer is very difficult to train because his attention is always closed, focused on something. A female, on the other hand, is always open because most of the time she is not focusing her attention on anything, especially during her menstrual period. The Nagual told me and then showed me that during that time I could actually let my attention go from the images of the world. If I don't focus my attention on the world collapses. How is that done, Gorda? It's very simple. When a woman menstruates, she cannot focus her attention. That's the crack the Nagual told me about. Instead of fighting to focus, a woman should let go of the images by gazing fixedly at distant hills, or by gazing at water like a river, or by gazing at the clouds. If you gaze with your eyes open, you get dizzy and the eyes get tired. But if you half close them and blink a lot and move them from mountain to mountain or from cloud to cloud, you can look for hours or days if necessary. The Nagual used to make us sit by the door and gaze at those round hills on the other side of the valley. Sometimes we used to sit there for days until the crack would open. I wanted to hear more about it, but she stopped talking and hurriedly sat very close to me. She signaled me with her hand to listen. I heard a faint swishing sound, and suddenly Lydia stepped out into the kitchen. I thought that she must have been asleep in their room and the sound of our voices had woken her up. She had changed the Western clothes she had been wearing the last time I had seen her and had put on a long dress like the Indian women of the area wore. She had a shawl on her shoulders and was barefoot. Her long dress, instead of making her look older and heavier, made her look like a child clad in an older woman's clothes. She walked up to the table and greeted La Gorda with a formal, "Good evening, Gorda." She then turned to me and said, "Good evening, Nagual." Her greeting was so unexpected and her tone so serious that I was about to laugh. I caught a warning from La Gorda. She pretended to be scratching the top of her head with the back of her left hand, which was clawed. I answered Lydia the same way La Gorda had. "Good evening to you, Lydia." She sat down at the end of the table to the right of me. I didn't know whether or not to start up a conversation. I was about to say something when La Gorda tapped my leg with her knee and with a subtle movement of her eyebrows signaled me to listen. I heard, again, the muffled sound of a long dress as it touched the floor. Josefina stood for a moment at the door before walking toward the table. She greeted Lydia, La Gorda, and myself in that order. I couldn't keep a straight face with her. She was also wearing a long dress, a shawl, and no shoes, but in her case the dress was 3 or 4 sizes larger, and she had put a thick padding into it. Her appearance was thoroughly incongruous. Her face was lean and young, but her body looked grotesquely bloated. She took a bench and placed it at the left end of the table and sat down. All 3 of them looked extremely serious. They were sitting with their legs pressed together and their backs very straight. I heard once more the rustle of a dress, and Rosa came out. She was dressed just like the others and was also barefoot. Her greeting was as formal, and the order naturally included Josefina. Everyone answered her in the same formal tone. She sat across the table facing me. All of us remained in absolute silence for quite a while. La Gorda spoke suddenly, and the sound of her voice made everyone else jump. She said, pointing to me, that the Nagual was going to show them his allies, and that he was going to use his special call to bring them into the room. I tried to make a joke and said that the Nagual was not there, so he couldn't bring any allies. I thought they were going to laugh. La Gorda covered her face, and the little sisters glared at me. La Gorda put her hand on my mouth and whispered in my ear that it was absolutely necessary that I refrain from saying idiotic things. She looked right into my eyes and said that I had to call the allies by making the moths call. I reluctantly began. But no sooner had I started than the spirit of the occasion took over, and I found that in a matter of seconds I had given my maximum concentration to producing the sound. I modulated its outflow and controlled the air being expelled from my lungs in order to produce the longest possible tapping. It sounded very melodious. I took an enormous gasp of air to start a new series, I stopped immediately. Something outside the house was answering my call. The tapping sounds came from all around the house, even from the roof. The little sisters stood up and huddled like frightened children around La Gorda and myself. "Please, Nagual, don't bring anything into the house," Lydia pleaded with me. Even La Gorda seemed a bit frightened. She gave me a strong command with her hand to stop. I had not intended to keep on producing the sound anyway. The Allies, however, either as formless forces or as beings that were prowling outside the door, were not dependent on my tapping sound. I felt again, as I had felt 2 nights before in Don Genaro's house, an unbearable pressure, a heaviness leaning against the entire house. I could sense it in my navel as an itch, a nervousness that soon turned into sheer physical anguish. The 3 little sisters were beside themselves with fear, especially Lydia and Josefina. Both of them were whining like wounded dogs. All of them surrounded me and then clung to me. Rosa crawled under the table and pushed her head up between my legs. La Gorda stood behind me as calmly as she could. After a few moments, the hysteria and fear of those 3 girls mounted to enormous proportions. La Gorda leaned over and whispered that I should make the opposite sound, the sound that would disperse them. I had a moment of supreme uncertainty. I really didn't know any other sound. But then I had a quick sensation of ticklishness on the top of my head, a shiver in my body, and I remembered out of nowhere a peculiar whistling that Don Juan used to perform at night and had endeavored to teach me. He had presented it to me as a means to keep one's balance while walking, so as not to stray away from the trail in darkness. I began my whistling, and the pressure in my umbilical region ceased. La Gorda smiled and sighed with relief, and the little sisters moved away from my side, giggling as if all of it had been merely a joke. I wanted to indulge in some soul-searching deliberations about the abrupt transition from the rather pleasant exchange I was having with La Gorda to that unearthly situation. For an instant, I pondered over whether or not the whole thing was a ploy on their part. But I was too weak. I felt I was about to pass out. My ears were buzzing. The tension around my stomach was so intense that I believed I was going to become ill right there. I rested my head on the edge of the table. After a few minutes, however, I was again relaxed enough to sit up straight. The 3 girls seemed to have forgotten how frightened they had been. In fact, they were laughing and pushing each other as they each tied their shawls around their hips. La Gorda didn't seem nervous, nor did she seem relaxed. Rosa was pushed at one moment by the other 2 girls and fell off the bench where all 3 of them were sitting. She landed on her seat. I thought that she was going to get furious, but she giggled. I looked at La Gorda for directions. She was sitting with a very straight back. Her eyes were half closed, fixed on Rosa. The little sisters were laughing very loudly, like nervous schoolgirls. Lydia pushed Josefina and sent her tumbling over the bench to fall next to Rosa on the floor. The instant Josefina was on the floor, their laughter stopped. Rosa and Josefina shook their bodies, making an incomprehensible movement with their buttocks. They moved them from side to side as if they were grinding something against the floor. Then they sprang up like 2 silent jaguars and took Lydia by the arms. All 3 of them, without making the slightest noise, spun around a couple of times. Rosa and Josefina lifted Lydia by the armpits and carried her as they tiptoed 2 or 3 times around the table. Then all 3 of them collapsed as if they had springs on their knees that had contracted at the same time. Their long dresses puffed up, giving them the appearance of huge balls. As soon as they were on the floor, they became even more quiet. There was no other sound except the soft swishing of their dresses as they rolled and crawled. It was as if I were watching a 3-dimensional movie with the sound turned off. La Gorda, who had been quietly sitting next to me watching them, suddenly stood up and with the agility of an acrobat ran toward the door of their room at the corner of the dining area. Before she reached the door, she tumbled on her right side and shoulder just enough to turn over once, then stood up, pulled by the momentum of her rolling, and flung open the door. She performed all her movements with absolute quietness. The three girls rolled and crawled into the room like giant pill bugs. La Gorda signaled me to come over to where she was. We entered the room and she had me sit on the floor with my back against the frame of the door. She sat to my right with her back also against the frame. She made me interlock my fingers and then placed my hands over my belly button. I was, at first, forced to divide my attention between La Gorda, the little sisters, and the room. But once La Gorda had arranged my sitting position, my attention was taken up by the room. The three girls were lying in the middle of a large white square room with a brick floor. There were 4 gasoline lanterns, one on each wall, placed on built-in supporting ledges approximately 6 feet above the ground. The room had no ceiling. The supporting beams of the roof had been darkened, and that gave the effect of an enormous room with no top. The 2 doors were placed on the very corners opposite each other. As I looked at the closed door across from where I was, I noticed that the walls of that room were oriented to follow the cardinal points. The door where we were was at the northwest corner. Rosa, Lydia, and Josefina rolled counterclockwise around the room several times. I strained to hear the swish of their dresses, but the silence was absolute. I could only hear La Gorda breathing. The little sisters finally stopped and sat down with their backs against the wall, each under a lantern. Lydia sat at the east wall, Rosa at the north, and Josefina at the west. La Gorda stood up, closed the door behind us, and secured it with an iron bar. She made me slide over a few inches without changing my position until I was sitting with my back against the door. Then she silently rolled the length of the room and sat down underneath the lantern on the south wall. Her getting into that sitting position seemed to be the cue. Lydia stood up and began to walk on the tips of her toes along the edges of the room, close to the walls. It was not a walk proper, but rather a soundless sliding. As she increased her speed, she began to move as if she were gliding, stepping on the angle between the floor and the walls. She would jump over Rosa, Josefina, La Gorda, and myself every time she got to where we were sitting. I felt her long dress brushing me every time she went by. The faster she ran, the higher she got on the wall. A moment came when Lydia was actually running silently around the 4 walls of the room, 7 or 8 feet above the floor. The sight of her running perpendicular to the walls was so unearthly that it bordered on the grotesque. Her long gown made the sight even more eerie. Gravity didn't seem to have any effect on Lydia, but it did on her long skirt. It dragged downward. I felt it every time she passed over my head, sweeping my face like a hanging drape. She had captured my attentiveness at a level I couldn't imagine. The strain of giving her my undivided attention was so great that I began to get stomach convulsions. I felt her running with my stomach. My eyes were getting out of focus. With the last bit of my remaining concentration, I saw Lydia walk down on the east wall, diagonal, and come to a halt in the middle of the room. She was panting, out of breath, and drenched in perspiration like La Gorda had been after her flying display. She could hardly keep her balance. After a moment, she walked to her place at the east wall and collapsed on the floor like a wet rag. I thought she had fainted, but then I noticed that she was deliberately breathing through her mouth. After some minutes of stillness, long enough for Lydia to recover her strength and sit up straight, Rosa stood up and ran without making a sound to the center of the room, turned on her heels, and ran back to where she had been sitting. Her running allowed her to gain the necessary momentum to make an outlandish jump. She leaped up in the air like a basketball player along the vertical span of the wall, and her hands went beyond the height of the wall, which was perhaps 10 feet. I saw her body actually hitting the wall, although there was no corresponding crashing sound. I expected her to rebound to the floor with the force of the impact, but she remained hanging there, attached to the wall like a pendulum. From where I sat, it looked as if she were holding a hook of some sort in her left hand. She swayed silently in a pendulum-like motion for a moment, and then catapulted herself 3 or 4 feet over to her left by pushing her body away from the wall with her right arm at the moment in which her swing was the widest. She repeated the swaying and catapulting 30 or 40 times. She went around the whole room, and then she went up to the beams of the roof where she dangled precariously, hanging from an invisible hook. While she was on the beams, I became aware that what I had thought was a hook in her left hand was actually some quality of that hand that made it possible for her to suspend her weight from it. It was the same hand she had attacked me with 2 nights before. Her display ended with her dangling from the beams over the very center of the room. Suddenly, she let go. She fell down from a height of 15 or 16 feet. Her long dress flowed upward and gathered around her head. For an instant before she landed without a sound, she looked like an umbrella turned inside out by the force of the wind. Her thin, naked body looked like a stick attached to the dark mass of her dress. My body felt the impact of her plummeting down, perhaps more than she did herself. She landed in a squat position and remained motionless, trying to catch her breath. I was sprawled out on the floor with painful cramps in my stomach. La Gorda rolled across the room, took her shawl, and tied it around my umbilical region like a band, looping it around my body 2 or 3 times. She rolled back to the south wall like a shadow. While she had been arranging the shawl around my waist, I had lost sight of Rosa. When I looked up, she was again sitting by the north wall. A moment later, Josefina quietly moved to the center of the room. She paced back and forth with noiseless steps between where Lydia was sitting and her own spot at the west wall. She faced me all the time. Suddenly, as she approached her spot, she raised her left forearm and placed it right in front of her face, as if she wanted to block me from her view. She hid half of her face for an instant behind her forearm. She lowered it and raised it again, that time hiding her entire face. She repeated the movement of lowering and raising her left forearm countless times as she paced soundlessly from one side of the room to the other. Every time she raised her forearm, a bigger portion of her body disappeared from my view. A moment came when she had hidden her entire body, puffed up with clothes behind her thin forearm. It was as if by blocking her view of my body, sitting 10 to 12 feet away from her, a thing she could have easily done with the width of her forearm, she also made me block the view of her body, a thing which could not possibly be done with just the width of her forearm. Once she had hidden her entire body, all I was able to make out was a silhouette of a forearm suspended in midair, bouncing from one side of the room to the other. And at one point, I could hardly see the arm itself. I felt a revulsion, an unbearable nausea. The bouncing forearm depleted me of energy. I slid down on my side, unable to keep my balance. I saw the arm falling to the ground. Josefina was lying on the floor covered with garments, as if her puffed-up clothes had exploded. She lay on her back with her arms spread out. It took a long time to get back my physical balance. My clothes were soaked in perspiration. I wasn't the only one affected. All of them were exhausted and drenched in sweat. La Gorda was the most poised, but her control seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. I could hear all of them, including La Gorda, breathing through their mouths. When I was in full control again, everybody sat on her spot. The little sisters were looking at me fixedly. I saw out of the corner of my eye that La Gorda's eyes were half closed. She suddenly rolled noiselessly to my side and whispered in my ear that I should begin to make my moth call, keeping it up until the allies had rushed into the house and were about to take us. I had a moment of vacillation. She whispered that there was no way to change directions, and that we had to finish what we had started. After untying her shawl from my waist, she rolled back to her spot and sat down. I put my left hand to my lips and tried to produce the tapping sound. I found it very difficult at first. My lips were dry and my hands were sweaty, but after an initial clumsiness, a feeling of vigor and well-being came over me. I produced the most flawless tapping noise I had ever done. It reminded me of the tapping noise I had been hearing all along as a response to mine. As soon as I stopped to breathe, I could hear the tapping sound being answered from all directions. La Gorda signaled me to go on with it. I produced 3 more series. The last one was utterly mesmeric. I didn't need to intake a gulp of air and let it out in small spurts, as I had been doing all along. This time, the tapping sound came out of my mouth freely. I didn't even have to use the edge of my hand to produce it. La Gorda suddenly rushed to me, lifted me up bodily by my armpits, and pushed me to the middle of the room. Her action disrupted my absolute concentration. I noticed that Lydia was holding on to my right arm, Josefina to my left, and Rosa had backed up against the front of me and was holding me by the waist with her arms extended backward. La Gorda was in back of me. She ordered me to put my arms behind and grab onto her shawl, which she had looped around her neck and shoulders like a harness. I noticed, at that moment, that something besides us was there in the room, but I couldn't tell what it was. The little sisters were shivering. I knew that they were aware of something which I was unable to distinguish. I also knew that La Gorda was going to try to do what she had done in Don Genaro's house. All of a sudden, I felt the wind of the eye door pulling us. I grabbed onto La Gorda's shawl with all my strength while the little sisters grabbed onto me. I felt that we were spinning, tumbling, and swaying from side to side like a giant weightless leaf. I opened my eyes and saw that we were like a bundle. We were either standing up or we were lying horizontally in the air. I couldn't tell which because I had no sensorial point of reference. Then, as suddenly as we had been lifted off, we were dropped. I sensed our falling in my midsection. I yelled with pain, and my screams were united with those of the little sisters. The insides of my knees hurt. I felt an unbearable jolt on my legs. I thought I must have broken them. My next impression was that something was getting inside my nose. It was very dark, and I was lying on my back. I sat up. I realized then that La Gorda was tickling my nostrils with a twig. I didn't feel exhausted or even mildly tired. I jumped to my feet, and only then was I stricken by the realization that we were not in the house. We were on a hill, a rocky, barren hill. I took a step and nearly fell down. I had stumbled over a body. It was Josefina. She was extremely hot to the touch. She seemed to be feverish. I tried to make her sit up, but she was limp. Rosa was next to her. As a contrast, her body was icy cold. I put one on top of the other and rocked them. That motion brought them back to their senses. La Gorda had found Lydia and was making her walk. After a few minutes, all of us were standing. We were perhaps half a mile east of the house. Years before, Don Juan had produced in me a similar experience, but with the aid of a psychotropic plant. He seemingly made me fly, and I landed a distance from his house. At the time, I'd tried to explain the event in rational terms, but there was no ground for rational explanations, and short of accepting that I had flown, I had to fall back onto the only two avenues left open. I could explain it all by arguing that Don Juan had transported me to the distant field while I was still unconscious under the effect of the psychotropic alkaloids of that plant. Or by arguing that under the influence of the alkaloids, I had believed what Don Juan was ordering me to believe, that I was flying. This time, I had no other recourse but to brace myself for accepting on its face value that I had flown. I wanted to indulge in doubts, began to wonder about the possibilities of the four girls carrying me to that hill. I laughed loudly, incapable of containing an obscure delight. I was having a relapse of my old malady. My reason, which had been blocked off temporarily, was beginning to take hold of me. I wanted to defend it, or perhaps it would be more appropriate to say, in light of the outlandish acts I had witnessed and performed since my arrival, that my reason was defending itself, independently of the more complex whole that seemed to be the me I did not know. I was witnessing, almost in the fashion of an interested observer, how my reason struggled to find suitable rationales, while another, much larger portion of me could not have cared less about explaining anything. La Gorda made the three girls line up. She then pulled me to her side. All of them folded their arms behind their backs. La Gorda made me do the same. She stretched my arms as far back as they would go, and then made me bend them and grab each forearm as tightly as possible, as close to the elbows as I could. That created a great muscular pressure at the articulations of my shoulders. She pushed my trunk forward until I was almost stooping. Then she made a peculiar bird call. That was a signal. Lydia started walking. In the darkness, her movements reminded me of an ice skater. She walked swiftly and silently, and in a few minutes, she disappeared from my view. La Gorda made two more bird calls, one after the other, and Rosa and Josefina took off in the same manner Lydia had. La Gorda told me to follow close to her. She made one more bird call, and we both started walking. I was surprised at the ease with which I walked. My entire balance was centered in my legs. The fact that I had my arms behind my back instead of hindering my movements aided me in maintaining a strange equilibrium. But above all, what surprised me the most was the quietness of my steps. When we reached the road, we began to walk normally. We passed two men going in the opposite direction. La Gorda greeted them, and they answered back. When we arrived at the house, we found the little sisters standing by the door, not daring to go in. La Gorda told them that although I couldn't control the allies, I could either call them or tell them to leave, and that the allies would not bother us any longer. The girls believed her, something I myself couldn't do in that instance. We went inside. In a very quiet and efficient manner, all of them undressed, drenched themselves with cold water, and put on a fresh change of clothes. I did the same. I put on the old clothes I used to keep in Don Juan's house, which La Gorda brought to me in a box. All of us were in high spirits. I asked La Gorda to explain to me what we had done. "We'll talk about that later," she said in a firm tone. I remembered then that the packages I had for them were still in the car. I thought that while La Gorda was cooking some food for us, it would be a good opportunity to distribute them. I went out and got them and brought them into the house. I placed them on the table. Lydia asked me if I had already assigned the gifts as she had suggested. I said that I wanted them to pick one they liked. She declined. She said that no doubt I had something special for Pablito and Nestor and a bunch of trinkets for them, which I would throw on the table with the intention that they fight over them. Besides, you didn't bring anything for Benigno, Lydia said as she came to my side and looked at me with mock seriousness. You can't hurt the Genaro's feelings by giving 2 gifts for 3. They all laughed. I felt embarrassed. She was absolutely right in everything that she had said. You're careless. That's why I've never liked you, Lydia said to me, changing her smile into a frown. You have never greeted me with affection or respect. Every time we saw each other, you only pretended to be happy to see me. She imitated my obviously contrived, effusive greeting, a greeting I must have given her countless times in the past. Why didn't you ever ask me what I was doing here? Lydia asked me. I stopped writing to consider her point. It had never occurred to me to ask her anything. I told her that I had no excuse. La Gorda interceded and said that the reason that I had never said more than 2 words to either Lydia or Rosa each time I saw them was because I was accustomed to talking only to women that I was enamored of in one way or another. La Gorda added that the Nagual had told them that if I would ask them anything directly, they were supposed to answer my questions, but as long as I didn't ask, they were not supposed to mention anything. Rosa said that she didn't like me because I was always laughing and trying to be funny. Josefina added that since I had never seen her, she disliked me just for fun, for the hell of it. I want you to know that I don't accept you as the Nagual, Lydia said to me. You're too dumb. You know nothing. I know more than you do. How can I respect you? Lydia added that as far as she was concerned, I could go back where I came from or go jump in a lake, for that matter. Rosa and Josefina didn't say a word. Judging by the serious and mean expressions on their faces, however, they seemed to agree with Lydia. How can this man lead us? Lydia asked La Gorda. He's not a true Nagual, he's a man. He's going to make us into idiots like himself. As she was talking, I could see the mean expressions on Rosa's and Josefina's faces getting even harder. La Gorda intervened and explained to them what she had seen earlier about me. She added that since she had recommended to me not to get entangled in their webs, she was recommending the same thing to them, not to get entangled in mine. After Lydia's initial display of genuine and well-founded animosity, I was flabbergasted to see how easily she acquiesced to La Gorda's remarks. She smiled at me. She even came and sat next to me. You're really like us, eh? She asked, in a tone of bewilderment. I didn't know what to say. I was afraid of blundering. Lydia was obviously the leader of the Little Sisters. The moment she smiled at me, the other 2 seemed to be infused instantly with the same mood. La Gorda told them not to mind my pencil and paper and my asking questions, and that in return I wouldn't be flustered when they became involved in doing what they loved the most, to indulge in themselves. The 3 of them sat close to me. La Gorda walked over to the table, got the packages, and took them out to my car. I asked Lydia to forgive me for my inexcusable blunderings of the past, and asked all of them to tell me how they had become Don Juan's apprentices. In order to make them feel at ease, I gave them an account of how I had met Don Juan. Their accounts were the same as what Doña Soledad had already told me. Lydia said that all of them had been free to leave Don Juan's world, but their choice had been to stay. She, in particular, being the first apprentice, was given an opportunity to go away. After the Nagual and Genaro had cured her, the Nagual had pointed to the door and told her that if she didn't go through it then, the door would close her in and would never open again. My fate was sealed when that door closed, Lydia said to me. Just like what happened to you. The Nagual told me that after he had put a patch on you, you had a chance to leave, but you didn't want to take it. I remembered that particular decision more vividly than anything else. I recounted to them how Don Juan had tricked me into believing that a sorceress was after him, and then he gave me the choice of either leaving for good or staying to help him wage a war against his attacker. It turned out that his alleged attacker was one of his confederates.